Propagandists read their audiences shrewdly, playing on their fears. For recruiting purposes, they framed images of German soldiers as fiendish, not heeding civilians or respecting women. The Huns were atrocious. Fierce Germans were to blame for this war, and no one else. This was a perilous war, involving here as well as there, Australia as well as Europe. Germans wanted to possess Australia. More recruits were needed to stop them. Ordinary Germans were just as bad as the soldiers, not heeding the plight of the civilians where their soldiers had invaded. Everyday Germans wanted God to punish England for a war that they had started. Many Germans from South Australia had crossed to the Albury District in the 1860s, forming the biggest settlement of Germans in New South Wales. In their villages, anti-war propaganda, anti-German propaganda incited mistrust of the local barber and newsagent. In spite of the wartime restrictions on aliens, the suspect might own a gun, a camera, a car, or homing pigeons. Loyal citizens and local police were keen to draw attention to such suspicious activities. In Wiradjuri in 1915, there was a pub fight sparked by name-calling. At West Wiradjuri, the schoolmaster said parents complained about flying the British flag as other schools did, and about their children singing patriotic British songs. Germans found it hard to get jobs and to keep them. Herbert Slink from Wodonga was the senior medical officer at Liverpool camp. He had to resign his commission when questions were asked in Parliament about why a person with a German name was in charge of a military hospital. When members of the Albury Battery presented themselves at Albury railway station, all fitted out to go abroad, some were told to stand aside and go home, because their parents had been born in Germany. Germerton Shire Council decided to change its name. It wanted to hand down to posterity the way its residents detested the fiendishness of the German nation. Any name would do as long as it was patriotic. They fixed on Holbrook to show they were not a German settlement like Walla Walla. People of German descent, it was said, were too pro-German to be patriotic, and at the conscription referenda, electoral officials could set aside votes of those of enemy origin, and those of their children, even if they were naturalised. That meant they were disenfranchised, excluded from community. Still, places with large numbers of Germans voted no in 1916 and again in 1917. In 1917, voting eligibility grew very tight. Voters had to prove where they were born. Postmen were given a penny halfpenny for every name they supplied of a person who could be ineligible to vote. In the Hume electorate, including Albury, they earned £12 for nearly 2,000 possible disqualifications. As a consequence of the failed referenda, recruitment propaganda became even more forceful. Our boys desperately needed reinforcements. The Germans were more and more atrocious. They were not to be trusted in any talks of a negotiated peace after Russia left the war. Australia was more and more threatened. Denunciations of the enemy within were even more vigorous. At the beginning of 1917, the local bank manager described Walla Walla as an Australian Berlin, a hotbed of disloyalty. Harry Pake, who'd been vigorous speaking out about people being disenfranchised, led a protest with the same vigour. A Secret Service agent was sent to spy on the Germans in the Riverina. He found many still spoke German and had pictures of Germany and the German royal family in their households. 4 members of the Colcan Shire Council were arrested and sent to Holsworthy Detention Centre near Liverpool. This was a military precaution. No charges were laid, and consequently there was no opportunity to refute them. Harry Pake had never dissuaded people from volunteering. He and his wife Emma had raised over £1,000 for patriotic funds. But he was, however, the loudest protester, speaking out against German Australians being disenfranchised. Embarrassingly for the military authorities, John Winky's son David had just been sent home invalided from France with wounds in his head. The authorities released Winky as soon as they found his family had made such a considerable commitment to the war effort. At Holsworthy, Pake became president of an association of interned Australian-born. An unofficial medal commemorates all those interned as our wartime imprisoned. After the war, Pake and Winky stood for re-election to Culcairn Shire Council, but were prevented by the protests of returned soldiers. At the end of the war, a Soldiers' Memorial Hall was added to the Literary Institute in Walla Walla. It holds an honour board proudly commemorating the names of those who voluntarily enlisted to fight for empire against Prussian militarism. On it are several German names from this place that had been labelled an Australian Berlin, a hotbed of disloyalty.